Okay, so this one, there have been several things kind of rattling around in this skull of mine over the course of the summer. I've got just a little bit more time left before I have to go back to the world of full time employment, so I wanted to kind of get this out of my system before that. I may do another one of these some other day, right before I have to go back and whatever, but for this one, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of a realization I had over the course of the summer. Obviously, I've been keeping up with my reading, slower than I like to, but I've been keeping up with that. I've been listening to a lot more music, particularly I've been trying out a bunch of new musicians, new bands, that sort of thing. And the thing that dawned on me is that a lot of the writers that I've read at this point have led pretty unhinged lives. And a lot of the musicians that I've listened to and do listen to, um, kind of, in spite of the stereotype, lead pretty well adjusted lives. Um, you always going to get your oddballs, of course, your Gigi Allens and all that. But like Jimi Hendrix was probably, and him maybe Led Zeppelin in the '60s and '70s. How long is it going to be for those numbers out of my system? But back in the '60s, '70s, kind of the peak of the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing. They're probably the stereotypical examples of like just these wild musicians. And Jimi Hendrix, like contrary to all the stereotypes, as best I can tell from what I've learned about him, was a really shy dude, which definitely contrasts with the whole persona, the stereotype, I guess, again, that kind of goes along with him. He was apparently pretty weak-willed. He would just kind of go along with whatever people asked of him and told him to do, to the point where like his manager or somebody like that ended up stealing like 90% of all his earnings one year or something like that. But then you also get Led Zeppelin, and you get all these stories that were kind of promoted by their manager about them going on these big giant drug binges and all that after shows and all these giant parties. And in reality, like they would get back on the plane after a concert, and Robert Plant would apparently be reading The Lord of the Rings while they were flying off to San Antonio or wherever. Um, Maybe that'll be another video. It's kind of like music and literary crossovers, because that's another thing is you get a lot of songs they came out with that, because The Lord of the Rings had just come out relatively recently, then they like wove that into a lot of their music. I'll save that for another one. But contrary to that, a lot of the more prolific writers I've noticed have led completely unhinged lives, to the point where it almost seems like you can't be a notable writer and also be well adjusted. So I jotted down actually a note of some of those so I can keep myself straight. I guess I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to just kind of highlight some of those. I guess I'll start from the top with Hemingway, who I guess there's a lot of things. To be honest, I don't know a ton about Hemingway. I know there's people that like make that their life's purpose. Like he's got a whole fan club, like a cultish almost following. But I just don't happen to be in that group. What I do know about him though is that apparently, I'm gonna get some of the specifics wrong, but apparently he had like multiple siblings commit suicide. He, I think, had one of his parents committed suicide. He had multiple cousins commit suicide. Obviously, he himself committed suicide after multiple attempts. There was this whole fact that he was a big game hunter. He apparently, that was the whole thing, like in the early 1900s. What to make of that, I don't know. There's probably some implication with modern day society and all that, but apparently, there's a big thing in the early 1900s was like mothers raising their sons almost as girls, or at least styling them as girls. Famously, I guess like FDR was one of those, but also Hemingway apparently was one of those. And I don't know if there's some kind of like compensation sort of thing he was doing, but he kind of seemed to purposely cultivate the sort of persona of this kind of machismo, this bravado, like swaggering kind of guy. He would go out big game hunting. Apparently, on one of those big game hunts somewhere in Africa, I think, his plane went down when he was getting out there, and they had to send another plane to come and rescue him and bring him to the hospital. And then that plane also went down. So apparently, like, just fate did not like him. I think if I remember hearing something about he volunteered to work for the CIA because he was living in Cuba at the time, and this was the height of the Cold War, and he just like volunteered that while he was going on his fishing trips or something, he would be looking out for the Cuban Navy or something about that. But Hemingway, already not exactly a normal human being. Somehow, with the second person I wanted to talk about, Yukio Mishima, who I mentioned in one of those other videos, maybe even the last one, somehow even less adjusted. Another guy that I don't know a ton about, what I do know is that he was born, like the 1930s. So he was like, he was growing up in the middle of World War II, like in the bad years of World War II for Japan, like when the war had already turned for them. So he grew up already in a pretty outrageous, sort of not exactly normal time to be alive. But apparently he was a fairly frail sort of guy. And he became kind of obsessed with this whole idea of aesthetics on top of that, about like the aesthetic appeal of certain things, just beauty and all that. And so he decided he was going to get into weightlifting, like particularly bodybuilding. And he also, as again, I think I said in the last video, was a bisexual fascist who had a coup to overthrow the government and reinstate the emperor. And apparently, what I didn't mention in that last video was apparently, from what I gather, he had no intention of that actually succeeding. He just did it for the vibe, like for the whole aesthetic, like tragic death sort of aspect of it. Apparently, he, I think, was married to a woman who was fairly famous in Japan. I think she was like the niece or the daughter of some like high up government official. And he also kind of started to blow up as a writer around that time, which is also, I should probably point out, like there's interviews of him, I think in like the 70s, like doing video interviews. Like this is recent enough you can actually hear him talk about this stuff, in addition to writing about it. But he had like a civil militia sort of thing that he started. He apparently pulled some of the strings through his wife's acquaintances and managed to like let the Japanese military train him with like their special ops soldiers or something. And then I guess he was like in his early 40s, something like that, and led that coup where he led like, I think just a few of these like high school students from his civil militia thing and like led them to some military base in Japan. And he like walked in with a bunch of guns, and when there was apparently some siege and some standoff with the police, and he ended up committing seppuku at the end of it. Like he had one of the dudes that was with him like ritually kill him, which was apparently entirely planned. Apparently he had no intention of that actually working. He just did it for the vibes. Third on my list is Hunter S. Thompson. I'm not even going to talk about Hunter S. Thompson. His reputation precedes him. Also a fellow Kentuckian, and again, his reputation precedes him. Somebody also, though, I don't know a ton about, don't know that there is a ton about, Herman Melville, who I heard apparently his family was kind of upper middle class. They were fairly well off New England family, and his dad, something like, had some risky investments or something like that. If it hasn't become obvious by now, I did not fact check any of this. I'm just going off the top of the dome, so some of the details are murky. I might not be 100% right on all this, but his dad basically had risky investments or something like that. Long story short, they ended up kind of falling on hard times financially. So he kind of grew up with this silver spoon and lost that over the course of his like late teens, early 20s. In his middle 20s, he, I think, he was a teacher for like 3 or 4 years, decided that's not for me, and went off and joined the Navy. And then they were somewhere off the coast of like Australia or New Zealand or somewhere, and he just completely went AWOL, just deserted, and just lived on an island in the Pacific. Keep in mind, like the middle of the 1800s, when that part of the world, like there are quite literally like cannibal tribes still very much active and controlling islands in Polynesia. Then just went and lived with them. So when he wrote Moby Dick, a lot of the stuff that he's writing about these Polynesians and about these whaling ships going through that area and about like these cannibals from there was literal firsthand experience that he had interacting with these people. Another one, I guess, to go off to Russia, Alexander Pushkin, who is basically Russia's Shakespeare, except he led a way more interesting life. I'll try to make this quick because I'm already halfway through my list, and I don't know how long this has been going on for, but he apparently was like a savant of sorts as a kid. He was put into some program when he was like an early teenager. I think he was like 12, 13, something like that. And he was put in this program for like gifted students, where apparently the Russian government at the time had this initiative they were trying to push, where they wanted to kind of promote the arts and kind of develop these young people to create this next generation of poets. And apparently 100% worked with Pushkin. They sent him off. They sent him all off to some like boarding school out in the middle of nowhere, apparently, in this almost like village where they were kind of cloistered away. And apparently he was a standout even amongst all these savants. He apparently had a great grandfather, I think it was, who was like Peter the Great's like personal, I don't know if I call him servant or like mentor mentee sort of relationship. I'm not exactly sure what was going on, but apparently his great grandfather, whoever this was, I forget his name, was the son of some African tribal leader from like Central Africa that had been taken as a prisoner of war at the end of a war and sold off into slavery to Peter the Great. And that's just his great grandfather. He wrote like different stories about him, but he comes out of that boarding school, starts to write. He does a bunch of stuff where he kind of toes the line. This is Russia. I guess nothing's changed. So there's a censor, and he's supposed to like pass what he writes through the censor, and then they'll edit out what they want to edit out, approve what they want to approve, and then actually publish it. Apparently, he got in trouble with them more than once and was exiled a couple times. Apparently, also he very, very much liked the whole savant thing went to his head. He was apparently insanely arrogant, which is a trend that'll pop up again in this list. Apparently, he was insanely arrogant and made a point of like really leaning into the whole playboy lifestyle, to the point where I forget exactly who it was. I want to say it was Lord Byron for some reason. I don't know why. I might be wrong on that. But he just made up his mind that he wanted to sleep with Lord Byron's wife, and so he did. Like he like sought her out at some event they were going to that he made a point to attend, and like wooed her and yada yada yada. And apparently that wasn't the only person he did that with. He apparently had a kind of thing for sleeping with other dudes' wives. Not only that, but I remember I read the first little bit of Evgeny Onegin, his like long lyric poem thing. I stopped at about the point where he went on for about 4 pages about feet and about how much he loved them. So yeah, that was a thing. He also famously died in a duel. Apparently one of the guys whose wives he slept with didn't really take too kindly to that, challenged him to a duel, and won that duel, and that was the end of Pushkin. Next on the list, I guess sticking with Russia, is somebody I've already talked about in all of these, and I could go on for probably an hour about, but I won't because I'm not quite that autistic. I've got enough self-awareness. But I guess I'll limit myself to 2 or 3 things about Dostoevsky, who, as I think I started to mention in another one of these videos, was, I don't even know where to start this. I guess I'll just say this. He started writing, I think, when he was like 27. He got off to, I think he was in some military school. He was going to be some like not middle management, some like lesser officer in the military, in some like engineering corps or something. And about that time started writing, just because he felt that he needed to. It was like this passion project he had, started writing. And the very first thing that he literally ever wrote was like picked up by all the critics in Russia. He was hailed as like the next big thing, the next Pushkin, and that completely went to his head. Apparently, I've heard like other contemporaries of his, like different letters they wrote and that sort of thing to other people about Dostoevsky. They all said he was like the most arrogant person that they ever ran into. But he's riding high off that success. He ends up getting involved with this like political literary circle that is publishing some kind of anti-czarist sort of stuff. And this is in a point in time where it is not safe to be doing that sort of thing. It's kind of a politically tense sort of point in Russian history, and they already don't take too kindly to that sort of thing. And they arrest all the members of this, I guess, the Petrashevsky circle they were called, and Dostoevsky's one of them, and they have a date scheduled for them to be executed. They bring them all out on that date, have them like dressed out, blindfolded, all that, in front of the square, and they bring them out. take off their blindfolds, and they like line. They apparently, because literally, I'll have it right beside me. This was the part in The Idiot that I was talking about, where he literally just included this story in that as like a fictional example of it. But they lined them all up, and he was in, I think, the third group of all these prisoners to be executed. And as they are like lining up to shoot this first group, this reprieve comes in on this horse. This guy on a horse rides in and stops them. Yeah, stop. This reprieve's been given by the Tsar, and apparently it was a 100% staged sort of thing. And instead of executing them, he has them all, in his mercy and all that, sent off to Siberia for like, I think 7 years is how long he was there. He wrote another book back here somewhere on my shelf about that. Somehow that's like only the second most interesting thing that happened to him. I guess the other things I'll point out, I'll stick to these two. For one, he was a degenerate gambler, like a degenerate gambler. He apparently would go, I think it was to Baden-Baden, I want to say, someplace in Germany that, from what I gather, was basically like when people here in Kentucky go off to Indiana to the casinos. He would make a trip every few years, go off to the city in Germany, go off to the casinos, and would basically just stay there until he was completely broke. Apparently he went there with his wife one time and got so broke that they literally had to sell her extra clothes to be able to afford a train ticket to get back. He would like have to ask her family members for money and like that sort of thing. Well, apparently he got himself in a lot of trouble with one of these and made a pretty one-sided contract with this like publisher in Russia that he had like a year, I think it was, to publish a book that was so long. They had like some page limit to it, word limit, something like that. And apparently 1 month went by, 2 months went by, 3 months went by. I should probably point out, I forgot to say, apparently one of the stipulations of this contract was he had this year to write it. If he did, he'd be paid for it. He'd be able to pay off his gambling debt. Actually, I think they paid him in advance, which is why he took this. But the stipulation was if he did not actually finish through with his end of the contract, that all the rights to everything he had ever written and ever would write belonged to this publisher. And as he would, he waited 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, waited 11 months to even begin writing anything, which I guess is a shout out to all my procrastinators out there. He freaks out as he would, and I think he went, I might be mixing together different stories here, but I think he went to some like local school in St. Petersburg, and it was like apparently a school for young women. They were like teaching him to type or something. That was a big thing around that time. And so he's like, hey, can I get one of your students to like help me write this? And apparently he did like the 1800s equivalent of the whole speech to text, and he would just say out what he wanted to write, and she would just type it down. That'll come in mystery mouse tool. Keep that in the back pocket for later. But he starts writing this book that ends up becoming The Gambler, and he writes it literally, like finishes it the day of when it's due to the publisher. He goes over, and apparently the publisher, from what I heard, was kind of aware that he was in this time crunch, and so they purposely closed down that day so that he couldn't actually submit it. And Dostoevsky, he went down to the publisher's office, like, here, I've got it. Apparently, I think it went to the courts, and they ended up siding with him. They're like, no, he had it in time, all that. So he quite literally gambled, like, his entire livelihood away. I guess the last story I'll mention, which is kind of sweet and kind of creepy, and I think ties into that last story. I might be mixing them together again. But the lady that had helped him type that book apparently went on to work with him on some other stuff, and apparently eventually Dostoevsky decided that he developed feelings for her, I guess you'll say, which was odd because she was like in her early 20s, and I think he was like in his mid 40s by then. This is eventually the wife that I mentioned in that first story, which I guess spoils all that, but he apparently said that he was writing some kind of story, and he wanted her opinion on how to write a certain character, and that this certain character was some like 40-something-year-old guy, and that there was somebody that worked for him, and that he developed feelings for them. And apparently she like read right through what he was insinuating and basically said, yes, I'll marry you, and the rest is history and all that. I'd like to say there was a happy ending to that, but from what I understand, he also like cheated on her multiple times. Again, that whole arrogant thing. Hopefully, I don't know how much time I've already gone through with this, so I'll make these last ones quick. George Eliot, who I'm reading, I guess it's in the other room right now, still reading Middlemarch. I don't know a ton about her. I say her because that was a fake name she used to publish under. From the bit I do know about her, apparently the reason she did that was because she herself was in a bit of an interesting relationship. She was married and did not live with that guy, and instead went and like married another guy, but that wasn't legal in the UK because she was still married to this other guy, and they never got that annulled. They never got a divorce, anything like that. She was technically legally still married to this guy. Apparently they just didn't have anything to do with each other after a while. He went on and was living with some lady, and she went on and was living with this other guy. And so she kind of took to secrecy to write all her stuff like that. Also, Mary Shelley, don't know a ton about. What I do know is another one of those kind of like Pushkin, kind of like savant figures. Published Frankenstein, if I remember, when she was 17 years old, which makes me feel a lot less secure in my accomplishments. I think both of her parents were like prolific writers and like political activists in their own right. Going down the list, I'll again make this quick. Voltaire. I don't know a ton about Voltaire either, which is why I included him towards the end here. One story I do know about him is apparently him and some buddies got together to basically find a way to rig the lottery, and then went up and bought like 50% of all the lottery tickets across all of Paris and had this whole scheme they developed. I don't know if it worked or whatever, but the last one I wanted to point out and talk a little bit about was Ivan Turgenev. Him and Dostoevsky were writing around the same time, also Tolstoy, but I'm not going to yap about him. Got to draw the line somewhere. Dostoevsky and Turgenev were writing at the same time. Apparently they had like a spat at some point. Dostoevsky like pretty much publicly called him out about something. But I bring him up because apparently he, following this whole trend of interesting relationships, keep in mind this is like 1800s in Orthodox Christian Russia, he apparently followed around this actress, this like French actress, like stage actress. Movies wouldn't be a thing for another few decades. But he followed her around pretty much all around Europe, and she was still married, like 100% married. Her husband knew that he was following her around and was completely okay with it. Apparently he was like the original cuck, and he just let Turgenev sleep with his wife openly. Apparently this was like an open secret across all of Europe. He was like one of the most famous people in all of Europe at that time. Apparently he was like more famous than Tolstoy and Dostoevsky around them. I'd like to say I have some like little anecdote to tie all this together with. I don't. I just want to yap and rant about that. So draw your own conclusions.